is different from what Theresa May and David Cameron did before, in that it is a break, if you like, from the rules-based international world order. There is, he thinks, an emerging new world order in which there's the rise of China, the rise of a more authoritarian government. And what does that mean for the rules that have governed the international order and Western democracies for decades? Well, it means, he thinks, change, and the Prime Minister will set that all out in the Commons. If we drill down into what the main points, the main ambition, the vision of the document is, there is hope, if you like, that democracies can thrive and prosper and international cooperation can continue. And with that in mind, the main ambition, the Prime Minister will say, for the UK is that climate change and protecting biodiversity will be, as a country, our #1 international priority. He will also recommit to spending 0.7% of gross national income on overseas development aid. You'll remember this was very contentious when the government decided to temporarily cut aid. They said it was because of coronavirus, the crisis, so they'll recommit to that when the fiscal situation allows. And then another aim is to secure the UK's status as a science and tech superpower by 2030. But the risks, as I was pointing to, and the recognition of growing risks and instability is there too. So the Prime Minister, in a big reversal or change in policy, if you like, will increase the cap on nuclear warheads by more than 40% to 240. There had been a cap of 180 warheads. That ends the gradual decline of nuclear weapons since the end of the Cold War. A real nod there, if you like, to not soft power, but hard power. And I think he's in, so let's listen to him.
On the government's integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy, which we are publishing today. The overriding purpose of this review, the most comprehensive since the Cold War, is to make the United Kingdom stronger, safer and more prosperous, while standing up for our values. Our international policy is a vital instrument for fulfilling this government's vision of uniting and levelling up across our country, reinforcing the Union and securing Britain's place as a science superpower and a hub of innovation and research. The review describes how we will bolster our alliances, strengthen our capabilities, find new ways of reaching solutions and relearn the art of competing against states with opposing values. We will be more dynamic abroad and more focused on delivering for our citizens at home. I begin with the essential fact that the fortunes of the British people are almost uniquely interlinked with events on the far side of the world. With limited natural resources, we have always earned our living as a maritime trading nation. In 2019, the UK sold goods and services overseas worth £690 billion, fully a third of our GDP, sustaining millions of jobs and livelihoods everywhere from Stranraer to St Ives, and making our country the 5th biggest exporter in the world. Between 5 and 6 million Britons, nearly 1 in 10 of us, live permanently overseas, including 175,000 in the Gulf and nearly 2 million in Asia and Australasia. So a crisis in any of those regions, or in the trade routes connecting them, would be a crisis for us from the very beginning. The truth is that even if we wished it, and of course we don't, the UK could never turn inwards or be content with the cramped horizons of a regional foreign policy. For us, there are no faraway countries of which we know little. Global Britain is not a reflection of old obligations, still less a vainglorious gesture, but a necessity for the safety and prosperity of the British people in the decades ahead. And I'm determined that the UK will join our friends to ensure that free societies flourish after the pandemic, sharing the risks and burdens of addressing the world's toughest problems. The UK's presidency of the G7 has already produced agreement to explore a global treaty on pandemic preparedness, working through the WHO, the World Health Organization, to enshrine the steps that countries will need to take to prevent another COVID. We will host COP26 in Glasgow in November and rally as many nations as possible behind the target of net zero by 2050. Leading by example, since the UK was the first major economy to accept this obligation in law. Britain will remain unswervingly committed to NATO and preserving peace and security in Europe. And from this secure basis, we will seek out friends and partners wherever they can be found, building a coalition for openness and innovation, and engaging more deeply in the Indo-Pacific. I have invited the leaders of Australia, South Korea and India to attend the G7 summit in Carbis Bay in June. And I'm delighted to announce that I will visit India next month to strengthen our friendship with the world's biggest democracy. Our approach will place diplomacy first, and the UK has applied to become a dialogue partner of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and we will seek to join the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement. But all our international goals rest upon keeping our people safe at home and deterring those who would do us harm. So we will create a counter-terrorism operations centre, bringing together our ability to thwart the designs of terrorists, while also dealing with the actions of hostile states. And it is almost exactly 3 years since the Russian state used a chemical weapon in Salisbury, killing an innocent mother, Dawn Sturgis, and bringing fear to a tranquil city. I can announce that the National Cyber Force, which conducts offensive cyber operations against terrorists, hostile states and criminal gangs, will in future be located in a cyber corridor in the northwest of England. And we will also, well, close, Mr. Speaker, and we will also establish a cross-government situation centre in the Cabinet Office, learning the lessons of the pandemic and improving our use of data to anticipate and respond to future crises. The first outcome of the integrated review was the government's decision to invest an extra £24 billion in defence, allowing the wholesale modernisation of our armed forces and taking forward the renewal of our nuclear deterrent. The new money will be focused on mastering the emerging technologies that are transforming warfare, reflecting the premium placed on speed and deployment and technical skill. And my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, will set out the details next week. Later this year, HMS Queen Elizabeth will embark on her maiden deployment, leading a carrier strike group on a 20,000-mile voyage to the Indo-Pacific and back, exercising with Britain's allies and partners along the way and demonstrating the importance we attach to the freedom of the seas. By strengthening our armed forces, we will extend British influence while simultaneously creating jobs across the United Kingdom, reinforcing the Union and maximising our advantage in science and technology. This government will invest more in research and development than any of our predecessors, because innovation is the key to our success at home and abroad, from speeding our economic recovery to shaping emerging technologies in accordance with freedom and openness. We will better protect ourselves against threats to our economic security. Our newly independent trade policy will be an instrument for ensuring that the rules and standards in future trade agreements reflect our values. Our newly independent sanctions policy already allows the UK to act swiftly and robustly wherever necessary, and we were the first European country to sanction the generals in Myanmar after the coup last month. In all our endeavours, the United States will be our greatest ally and a uniquely close partner in defence, intelligence and security. Britain's commitment to the security of our European home will remain unconditional and immovable, incarnated by our leadership of NATO's deployment in Estonia. We shall stand up for our values as well as for our interests. And here I commend the vigilance and dedication of honourable members from all parties, because the UK, with the wholehearted support of this whole House, Mr. Speaker, has led the international community in expressing our deep concern over China's mass detention of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province, and in giving nearly 3 million of Hong Kong's people a route to British citizenship. There is no question that China will pose a great challenge for an open society such as ours. But we will also work with China where that is consistent with our values and interests, including building a stronger and positive economic relationship and in addressing climate change. The greater our unity at home, the stronger our influence abroad, which will in turn open up new markets and create jobs in every corner of the UK, not only maximising opportunities for the British people, but also, I hope, inspiring a sense of pride that their country is willing to follow in its finest traditions and stand up for what is right. With the extra investment and new capabilities of the integrated review, I believe the United Kingdom can thrive in an ever more competitive world and fulfil our historic mission as a force for the good. And I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We want this integrated review to work. Threats to our national security are increasing. They're becoming more complex and less predictable. So the government has to get this right. But this review is built on foundations that have been weakened over the last decade. The Prime Minister has spoken of an era of retreat. He's right. In the last decade of Conservative government, defence spending and pay for the armed forces both fell in real terms. Our armed forces numbers have been cut by 45,000. And there's still a black hole of 17 million in the defence equipment plan. So whilst we do welcome the long overdue increase in capital funding, we do welcome the creation of a counter-terrorism operations centre and new investment in cyber, the Prime Minister can't avoid the question that everyone in our armed forces and their families will be asking today. Prime Minister, will there be further cuts to the strength of our army and our armed forces? The British Army is already 6,000 below the minimal level set out in the last review. It's been cut every year for the last decade. And it's being reported, Mr. Speaker, that the Army will see a further reduction of 10,000, alongside fewer tanks, fewer jets for the RAF and fewer frigates for the Royal Navy. Prime Minister, if those reports are untrue, can that be said today? Because, Mr. Speaker, successive Conservative Prime Ministers have cut the armed forces, but at least they've had the courage to come to this House and say so. This statement was silent on the issue. After everything the armed forces have done for us, the Prime Minister has a duty to be straight with them today. Mr. Speaker, turning to foreign policy, Britain needs to be a moral force for good in the world once again, leading the fight against climate change, strengthening multinational alliances, including NATO, championing human rights, valuing international development, and ensuring that trade deals protect high standards and public services. But there's a huge gap between that and the government's actions. The review rightly concludes that Russia remains the most acute threat to our security. That's not new, Mr. Speaker. 18 months ago, the Russia review concluded that the threat was urgent and immediate. So why have none of its recommendations been implemented? The integrated review talks about the importance of upholding international law. I agree. But from Europe to the Indian Ocean, this government now has a reputation for breaking international law, not defending it. We welcome the deepening of engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. But this comes on the back of an inconsistent policy towards China for a decade. Conservative governments have spent 10 years turning a blind eye to human rights abuses while inviting China to help build our infrastructure. Now that basic inconsistency is catching up with them. The review also talks of conflict resolution. Yet there's nothing about updating our arms export regime, in particular suspending sales arms to Saudi Arabia. The Prime Minister's statement, Mr. Speaker, didn't mention international development once. And I wonder why. Because he's cutting development spending for the first time in decades and denying this House a vote on it. If global Britain is to mean anything, it cannot mean selling arms to Saudi Arabia and cutting aid to Yemen. Mr. Speaker, I voted for the renewal of Trident, and the Labour Party's support for nuclear deterrence is non-negotiable. But this review breaks the goal. This review breaks the goal of successive Prime Ministers and cross-party efforts to reduce our nuclear stockpile. It doesn't explain when, why, or for what strategic purpose. So the Prime Minister needs to answer that question today. On trade, we recognise the need for new and ambitious trade deals. There needs to be a major boost in UK exports over the next decade. But that has to start with making a success of the Brexit deal, and that won't happen unless we remove the new red tape that's now holding British businesses back. Mr. Speaker, Britain should and could be a moral force for good in the world. After a decade of neglect, this review was the chance to turn a corner. But there's now a very real risk that our armed forces will be stripped back even further, and that this review won't end the era of retreat. In fact, it'll extend it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, we have one of the toughest arms export regimes in the world under the consolidated guidance. Anybody listening to him would not realise, Mr. Speaker, we're the second biggest international donor of aid in the G7. And I think it's absolutely preposterous to hear the Labour leader calling for more investment in our armed forces, when this is the biggest investment in our armed forces since the Cold War. And when it wasn't so long ago, Mr. Speaker, £24 billion, wasn't so long ago, he was campaigning very hard, without dissent, to install a leader of the Labour Party as Prime Minister who wanted to withdraw from NATO and disband our armed forces. And the Right Honourable Lady heckles me from the front bench, Mr. Speaker, but it's ridiculous for him to talk about our nuclear defences, Mr. Speaker, when the reality is that Labour is all over the place. The shadow Foreign Secretary, the last time the House voted on our nuclear defences, protecting our nuclear defences, Mr. Speaker, the shadow Foreign Secretary voted against it, Mr. Speaker, and so did the current Labour Deputy Leader. And they want to talk about standing up for our armed forces, Mr. Speaker. Just in the last year, the Labour Party has been given the opportunity to back our armed services, our armed forces, our troops, our soldiers in the Overseas Operations Bill. They had the chance to stand up for veterans. They voted against it on a 3-line whip, Mr. Speaker. Those are the instincts of the Labour Party. Weak on supporting our troops, weak on backing Britain when it matters, and weak on defence.
Let's come to the Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, I think my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has pointed out that the present Labour leadership is more on the side of Ernest Bevin, who is against fascism and against left-wing both at home and abroad. And I think that's a sign of some kind of unity. The Prime Minister didn't mention development much in his statement, and I'd asked whether he would meet us to have a discussion on it. The question of meeting the 0.7%, 70 pence every £100 of our income, has been agreed. The government said it will be maintained. They now say there's going to be a gap and it will be restored. We want that gap to be evaporated, to go away, not to happen. The aid goes down with our income, it should go up with our income, and we should meet the commitment we've made in successive manifestos. I'll leave it to the Prime Minister to say when it is that those who are concerned for aid for Yemen and for VSO and others, will actually get the answer to whether they're going to be cut as well. I want to stand beside the Prime Minister as well as behind him, and we want to meet the commitment that he wrote in our 2019 manifesto, of proudly meeting that commitment.
Minister.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and I think people listening to this debate might not grasp that actually this country is the biggest European donor to Yemen, and given $1 billion over the last 6 years, 87 million this year, and I don't think they grasp that actually we're giving £10 billion in international aid. And I think we can be very proud of what we're doing. And of course we will return to the 0.7 target when fiscal circumstances allow.
Right, let us go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And let me thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. And let me also begin by thanking my SNP colleagues, led by the members for Glasgow South and Stirling, who compiled a very substantial and constructive submission on behalf of the SNP during the review's consultation. Mr Speaker, today's statement is one more insight into just how hollow the brand of global Britain actually is. Because the Prime Minister's rhetoric always fails to come close to reality. Today, the Prime Minister preaches about international obligation, when only yesterday our closest partners in the EU are bringing his government to court for breaking international law. The Prime Minister talks about partnership with nations across the world in the very week that the most senior figures in the US, including the Speaker of Congress, warned against the UK's increasingly unilateralist approach. The chasm between the Prime Minister's rhetoric and the reality of his government's actions is deeply damaging. Just because he wastes £2.6 million desperately trying to copy the White House's press briefing room doesn't hide the reality of the UK's weakening global influence. So, Mr Speaker, given our limited time, let me ask a number of specific questions that we demand answers to. On cuts to army personnel, Mr Speaker, we were promised that 12,500 personnel would be stationed permanently in Scotland. The current number remains well below 10,000, and not only that, it is expected that cuts of 10,000 to the army overall will take place. So will the Prime Minister be prepared to admit that this is one more broken Tory promise to our armed forces and to the people of Scotland? On international aid cuts, this review fails to immediately reinstate our moral obligation and his party's manifesto commitment to spend 0.7% on aid and development. Under this plan, countries devastated by war and famine, Yemen, Syria and South Sudan, will have their humanitarian aid slashed. And only this morning, it is emerging that this UK government also plans to cut its human rights support and anti-corruption measures by a staggering 80%. If the Prime Minister is prepared to stand over these callous cuts, is he also prepared to guarantee that he will put a straight vote on this in the House of Commons? And finally, on Trident nuclear weapons, this review disgracefully endorses the attainment of 80 more of these weapons of mass destruction. Can the Prime Minister tell us who gave his government the democratic right to renege on the UK's obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, this government continues to invest massively in projects that will bring benefit to the whole of the UK, including to Scotland, and I can tell him that there'll be further investments in Lossiemouth, that there is no threat, for instance, to the Black Watch, which I know that he and his colleagues sometimes like to raise in order to alarm people. We will continue to invest massively in overseas development aid, which he rightly mentions, and we're very proud of what we're doing. And by the way, that delivers 500 jobs in East Kilbride. We'll continue to invest in shipbuilding, which drives jobs across the whole of the UK and particularly in Scotland. And I think it's a fantastic thing to see those ships being built by apprentices in Govan, as he has, as I'm sure. The only thing that endangers those investments and working together as one UK, working with all the fantastic people in the armed services in Scotland, is the reckless referendum which I think his party insists on calling in the most inapposite time possible for this country.
We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Hilton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the comprehensive ambition set out in this important integrated review paper today. There is a 1930s feel to the scale of challenges that we face today, with rising authoritarian powers, weak global institutions, and an absence of Western leadership and collective resolve. I was hoping for a Fulton, Missouri moment, Mr. Speaker, when we finally call out China for the geostrategic threat that it is, and a commitment to our aid budget. But I do hope the Prime Minister will summon that Atlantic Charter spirit of working together with our closest ally, the United States, to strengthen the rules-based order, such as advancing the G7 to the G10, which could form the backbone to revising trade and security standards that our ever-dangerous world so desperately needs.
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and I must say that I think that there is a balance to be struck, because after all, we have a strong trading relationship with China worth about £81 billion. China is the second largest economy in the world and a fact of our lives, and I think we must accept that fact in a clear-eyed way. But we've also got to be tough where we see risk, and that's why this government has brought in the National Security and Investment Bill to protect our intellectual property. That's why we're protecting our critical national infrastructure. That's why my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has done more than I think virtually any other Foreign Secretary around the world to call out what China is doing in Xinjiang. And that's why this government has offered a place, a refuge and abode to 3 million Hong Kong Chinese who may be in fear of persecution as a result of what is happening in Hong Kong. This government takes a very, very clear-eyed approach to what is happening in China. It is a balanced approach, and one that I think the British people understand.
Chair of the PSC, Meg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot of words like ambition and innovation. So let me bring the Prime Minister a little bit back down to earth and sea. We have an aircraft carrier strike group with not enough aircraft and not enough ships to support it. We have rotting nuclear submarines, not a single one that has been decommissioned. We have a living accommodation for single personnel and families that is woefully inadequate and needing investment. Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, the maths doesn't add up. The gap in what's needed to just deliver what's in plan now is huge, even with the additional investment. So perhaps the Prime Minister could level with the House, the country and our armed forces and tell us now what's going to be cut so that this can be afforded.
Prime Minister.
I thank her, but she should recognise that this is the biggest commitment in spending on our armed forces since the end of the Cold War. Labour left a black hole in our defence money of 38 billion. 38 billion. Yes, they did. Yes, they did, Mr. Speaker. This is a massive investment, and it is designed to deal with the chronic problems that previous governments have failed to address. Modernising our forces with AI, with a future combat air system, and finally moving into cyber. I think that is the investment, the hard-edged investment this country needs to modernise our forces and take them forward. Labour consistently failed to do that.
Let's come to Dr. Julian Lewis.
As the Prime Minister just mentioned the National Security and Investment Bill, I hope I can rely on him to help the Intelligence and Security Committee remove the obstacles that are being placed in our way in wishing to scrutinise the work of its Investment Security Unit. Now, though there are strong analytical aspects to this review, it's suggested on pages 62 to 3 that our adversary, Communist China, quotes, is an increasingly important partner in tackling global challenges like pandemic preparedness, if you please, and that we want deeper trade links and more Chinese investment in the UK. Doesn't that unfortunately demonstrate that the grasping naivety of the Cameron-Osborne years still lingers on in some departments of state?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for those who call for a new Cold War on China, or for us to sequester our economy entirely from China, which seems to be the new policy of the opposition weaving, as they generally do, from one position to the next, are I think mistaken. We have a balance to strike, and we needed to have a clear-eyed relationship with China. Of course, we're protecting our critical national infrastructure, and we'll continue to do that, and we will make sure that through the Security and Investments Bill, we protect our national, we protect our intellectual property, and we will take tough measures, as I have said, to call out China for what they're doing in Xinjiang. And there is no one around the world who has done more on that matter than my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, or this government. We will continue to do that. Companies that profit from trade in forced labour will not be allowed to do so in this country. And I think the whole House should be very proud of what we're doing.
Let's go to Sarah Champion. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really shocked that development is barely mentioned in the integrated review. When will the Prime Minister understand that full tummies, economic opportunity and stable governments create the stronger, safer and more prosperous world that he wants, not more nuclear weapons? When we look at the cuts that we know of so far, cuts to the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund, 80% cuts in aid corruption work, how does this make sense to create this stable world? When does the government plan to publish its development strategy? Will it actually consult with the NGOs, the Global South, and indeed Parliament and the IDC on this review? Please tell us. We need to know the details.
Mr. Speaker, as I've just explained, the development remains an absolutely critical part of the UK's foreign and overseas policy, and £10 billion is being spent this year alone. Given what this country has been going through, given that we've been obliged to spend £280 billion to prop up jobs and livelihoods, another £63 billion to support the NHS, £37 billion on supporting local councils, I think it's up to members opposite to say which of that support for the NHS they would cut, what they would reduce to spend more on overseas aid. Of course we want the percentage to go back up again when fiscal circumstances allow. But I think people of common sense understand that £10 billion is a huge sum in the current circumstances, and they will appreciate that it is right to wait until fiscal circumstances have improved.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the integrated review as it's set out, and I welcome its aspiration to coherence. I also welcome the fact that many of the ideas, not just the author, have been stolen from the Foreign Affairs Committee, and on that I am very grateful. But may I ask that some of the aspects that we have touched on in the past few years are addressed in the strategies that have not been clarified in today's paper, strategies on artificial intelligence and indeed on different forms of financial threats. Because where we need to see the UK standing up for ourselves is not just in aid and sticking to the 0.7, which the Prime Minister has already touched on, but also in platforms, making sure that we don't just reallocate aid to defence, but we actually increase the number of ships so that our presence in the East is real and not digital. We also need to look hard at the new threats, from cryptocurrency to the financial misdealings in the City of London that threaten our national security so obviously, whether that's dirty Russian money or increasingly dirty Chinese money. We need to stand up for Britain's interests and bring these tools together. This is a very, very welcome start, but will he please put some meat on those bones and make sure that when we hear the command paper next week, we don't find that this is a snowstorm without the pounds attached.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pretty big blizzard of a snowstorm when you consider it's £24 billion and the biggest investment since the Cold War, and we cover every aspect of the subjects that he's just raised, from artificial intelligence to the threat of cryptocurrencies. And it remains the case that the UK, under these proposals, will continue to be able to project, one of the few countries in the world to be able to project force 8,000 miles, thanks to our carrier strike force. And we are making the investments now. We are making the investments now that are grasping the nettle that previous governments have failed to grasp for decades.
Let's go to Leila Moran. Leila Moran.
OK, and then we have it. The Prime Minister live in the Commons after he made that statement outlining the conclusions of that integrated review of security.